The candle had burned down to little more than a stub, and still he had not slept. On the desk before him lay a stack of letters, each one addressed and sealed, none of them ever sent. 7 years of them, 7 years of words he had written and could never give to her. "I have watched you," the topmost letter began in a hand that trembled slightly, "for so long now that I no longer remember what it felt like not to." He pressed his palm flat against the stack, as though he could feel the warmth of every unspoken thing inside them. "Welcome to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest, and where the women's society tried to silence become the most dangerous forces in England. I know it has been some time since we last gathered here together, and I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you for staying. Last time, several of you mentioned you were listening from places I'd never have guessed: a long-haul trucker outside of Adelaide, a nurse on her break in Manchester, someone tending a vineyard in the hills above Cape Town. I thought about that often during the time away. This community stretches further than I ever imagined, and I am so glad to be back here with you. So tell me, where are you tonight? What time is it where you are? I want to know who's here for this one, because I think it might be one of the most quietly devastating stories I've told yet. Tonight's story is about a woman who spent her whole life being told she was the disappointing one, the daughter who didn't marry well, who didn't shine, who simply didn't matter as much as her sisters did. And it's about a man who had loved her since before she knew what love was, who had watched her for 7 years from a distance so careful she never once suspected it, and who was finally done waiting. There is a room in this story, a locked room, in a house she had never been permitted to enter. And when she finally sees what's inside it, I promise you, it will take your breath away. Let me take you back to the autumn of 1854, to a modest stone house in Hampshire, where a woman named Winifred Calder was folding linens in a cold parlour and trying very hard not to cry. The Calder household had once been a respectable one. Mr. Calder, before his death some 8 years prior, had held a small but comfortable income, enough to give his 3 daughters a governess, a decent wardrobe, and the expectation of good marriages. 2 of those expectations had been met with what Mrs. Calder considered triumphant success. The eldest, Honora, had married a baronet's second son, and now lived in a handsome townhouse in Bath with 3 children and a lady's maid of her own. Winifred stopped folding the linen in her hands. She had not lost her place in the work. She had simply been distracted, the way she so often was these days, by the particular ache of being the only one left in this house. Her other sister, Theodosia, had married a clergyman with a respectable living near Winchester, and wrote letters full of news about the new curtains in the drawing-room and how well her husband's sermons were received. And Winifred had remained. She was 24 now, unmarried, and living in the same house she had grown up in, performing the same tasks she had performed since she was old enough to hold a needle, mending, folding, managing the household accounts that her mother found too tedious, and absorbing, again and again, the quiet disappointment that radiated from her mother like cold from a winter window. "You've let the hem come down on your blue dress again," Mrs. Calder said from her chair by the fire, not looking up from her correspondence. Honora would never let such a thing happen. She always took such care with her appearance. "Yes, mother," Winifred said. "It is no wonder," Mrs. Calder continued, setting down her pen with the particular precision of a woman about to deliver a familiar speech, "that you have not yet found a husband when you cannot even be troubled to mend your own hem." Winifred said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had heard variations of this conversation perhaps 1,000 times in the last 6 years, since her one and only season in London had ended without an offer, without even the suggestion of one, and her mother had decided, quietly but completely, that Winifred was simply not the kind of daughter who succeeded. It was not cruelty exactly. Mrs. Calder did not strike her, did not lock her in rooms, did not deny her food. It was something colder than that, a withdrawal so total that Winifred sometimes felt as though she had become a piece of furniture in her own home. Useful, necessary even, but not seen. She finished folding the linen and carried it to the cupboard, and as she did, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror that hung in the hallway. A woman with light brown hair pulled back severely, grey eyes that looked tired even when she had slept well, and a mouth that had, she thought, almost forgotten how to smile without effort. This is who I am now, she thought. This is who I will always be. She did not yet know that less than 30 miles away, a man who had once been a boy in this very neighbourhood, a boy she had not seen in 7 years, had just received word that his father, the old Duke of Penrose, had finally died, and that the title, the estates, and an income of nearly £40,000 a year now belonged to him. And she did not know that the very first thing he had done, upon receiving that news, was to ask his secretary a single question. Is she still there? Is she still in Hampshire? Now, before we go further, I think it's worth pausing here to talk about something that shaped every part of Winifred's life, and indeed the life of every unmarried woman in this story: the brutal mathematics of the London season. For a family like the Calders, the season was not a holiday. It was an investment. Often the single largest financial outlay a family would make for a daughter, short of her actual dowry. A young woman was typically given 2, perhaps 3 seasons to secure a match. Gowns had to be made, a townhouse or rooms had to be let, a chaperone had to be available, and invitations had to be secured to the right balls, the right musical evenings, the right private parties where eligible men might be encountered. Winifred had been given exactly 1 season. Her father had died the following winter, and with his death came the sharp contraction of the family's finances. There would be no second chance, no further investment. She had gone to London at 17, danced at perhaps a dozen balls, attracted no particular notice, and come home. And in the eyes of her mother, and indeed in the eyes of much of the society she had briefly moved through, that single failed season had defined her ever after. She was not a woman who simply hadn't yet married. She was a woman who hadn't taken, the way damp wood doesn't take a flame. It is difficult, I think, for those of us living now to fully understand how total that judgment could be. There was no second draft for a woman in Winifred's position. The story society told about her had already been written, and she was expected to live inside it for the rest of her life. When Winifred Calder went to bed that night, she had no reason to believe that anything about her life was about to change. She said her prayers, as she did every night, and she did not pray for a husband, or for wealth, or for escape. She prayed simply that she might stop feeling so invisible. She did not know that across the county, in the great house at Penrose, a man stood at the window of a room he had not entered in 7 years, a room he had built, piece by piece, in secret, and looked out at the darkness toward Hampshire and made himself a promise. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow I will see her again. Hugo, Duke of Penrose, was 34 years old, and he had spent the better part of the last decade being described, by those who did not know him well, as cold. It was not an entirely unfair assessment. He had inherited his title far sooner than he ever expected. His elder brother's death from a fever when Hugo was 27 had thrust him, without warning, into a role he had spent his whole life believing would never be his. He had thrown himself into it with a discipline that bordered on the punishing, learning the management of estates that spanned 4 counties, untangling debts his father had left carelessly knotted, sitting through endless sessions in the House of Lords on matters of land reform that bored him to the point of physical pain. He had done all of it without complaint, and without warmth, because warmth was not a thing he allowed himself to feel where anyone could see it. But there was one exception. There had always been one exception. When Hugo was 27, the same year, his brother died, though this had happened before that, in the spring. He had spent several months at a smaller property near the Calder estate, recovering from an injury sustained in a riding accident. He had been restless, in pain, and in no mood for company, and so he had taken to walking the lanes near the house at odd hours, when he was unlikely to encounter anyone. He had encountered Winifred Calder instead. She had been 17 then, walking with a basket of something. Herbs, he thought, though he could no longer be entirely sure, and she had not recognized him, because he had been dressed plainly and was, at that time, simply Lord Hugo, a younger son with no particular consequence. They had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes, about nothing of importance. She had asked, with a directness that startled him, whether his limp pained him very much, and when he admitted that it did, she had told him, without any of the simpering sympathy he was accustomed to from young ladies, that pain was simply something one carried until it became lighter, and that pretending otherwise only made the carrying harder. He had thought about that sentence for 7 years. He had returned to that stretch of road again and again during the remaining weeks of his stay, hoping to encounter her again. He had, twice. Both times the conversation had been brief, ordinary, unremarkable to anyone watching. And both times Hugo had walked away with the strange, unsettling sense that he had just spoken to the only person in England who had ever looked at him and seen him, rather than his title, his fortune, or his prospects. Then his stay had ended. He had returned to London, and then to his brother's funeral, and then to the crushing weight of the dukedom, and the years had simply gone. He had told himself more times than he could count that it had been nothing. A passing conversation, a girl he barely knew, but he had never stopped asking after her. His secretary, a discreet and long-suffering man named Mr. Aldous, had grown accustomed to the occasional, carefully casual question dropped into otherwise routine correspondence. "Is there any news from the families near the old Hampshire property?" And in this manner, over 7 years, Hugo had learned that Winifred Calder's father had died, that her sisters had married, that she had not, that she remained unmarried in the same house, while the world around her moved on without her. He had also done something he had never told anyone, not even Aldous. He had commissioned a portrait of her, not from life. He could hardly have arranged for her to sit for a painter without revealing himself entirely. He had described her, as best he could remember, to an artist in London, and the result had been imperfect, almost unrecognizable, and yet he had kept it. And then, a year later, dissatisfied, he had commissioned another, and another, each time trying to capture something he could not quite name, not merely her face, but the particular quality of attention she had given him, the directness of her grey eyes, the impression she had left of a person entirely unimpressed by dukes and titles and fortunes, who simply saw a man in pain and told him the truth about it. There were, by now, 11 such portraits. He kept them in a locked room at Penrose that no servant entered, that no guest had ever seen, and that he visited, he was ashamed to admit, more often than he visited the family chapel. He knew, of course, how it would sound, if anyone ever learned of it. He knew the word that polite society would use. Obsession. He had used it himself in the privacy of his own thoughts, on the nights when sleep would not come, and he found himself once again standing in that locked room, looking at 11 imperfect versions of a face he had not seen in 7 years. But on the night his father died, the night the title finally, irrevocably became his, the night he stopped being merely Lord Hugo and became the Duke of Penrose, with an income of nearly £40,000 a year and a power that very few men in England could match, he had stood in that room and made a decision. He was done waiting. He was done telling himself it was nothing. Tomorrow he would go to Hampshire. The morning came grey and damp, the kind of October morning that seemed to press itself against the window panes like something trying to get in. Winifred had risen early, as she always did, and was in the small back garden cutting the last of the autumn herbs when she heard the sound of carriage wheels on the lane. This was not in itself remarkable. The lane saw a reasonable amount of traffic, farmers, the occasional gig belonging to a neighbouring family, the post. But there was something different about the sound of these particular wheels. They were too smooth, too well sprung, the sound of a vehicle built for someone who never had to think about the cost of good axles. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and looked toward the lane just as the carriage came into view. It was black, lacquered to a shine that seemed almost indecent against the grey morning, with a crest on the door that she did not recognize, and 4 matched horses, 4 for a country lane, moving at a stately pace that nonetheless seemed to announce, without any need for words, that whoever sat inside that carriage was not accustomed to being kept waiting. The carriage did not pass the Calder house. It stopped in front of it. Winifred stood frozen for a moment, herbs still clutched in her apron, as a footman in dark livery climbed down and opened the carriage door, and a man stepped out. He was tall, taller than she remembered anyone being, though she could not immediately have said why she had expected to remember anything about him at all, and dressed with the kind of understated, expensive plainness that she had learned during her brief season, marked the truly wealthy from those merely trying to appear so. His coat was dark, beautifully cut, and entirely without ornament. His hair was a deep brown, cut shorter than fashion currently dictated, and there was something about the set of his shoulders, the careful stillness of his posture, that struck her as familiar in a way she could not place. He turned and looked toward the garden and saw her. For a long moment neither of them moved. Winifred's first thought, an absurd one, she knew even as she thought it, was that she recognized his eyes. They were a pale grey green, the colour of the sea on an overcast day, and she had the sudden dizzying sense of having seen them before, somewhere, long ago, though she could not place where. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, and carried easily across the garden despite its quietness. "I am looking for the Calder residence." "You found it." Winifred set down her basket and walked toward the low garden gate, very aware of her plain morning dress, her dirt-stained hands, the loose strands of hair that had escaped her pins. "I am Winifred Calder. May I ask who—" "Hugo Penrose," he said, and then, after the briefest pause, as though the title still did not sit entirely naturally on his tongue, "The Duke of Penrose." Winifred felt the words land somewhere in the centre of her chest. She had heard of the Duke of Penrose, of course. Everyone in 3 counties had heard of the Penrose estate, of its enormous wealth, of the old Duke's recent death, and the elevation of his second son to the title. But she had not connected that name, that distant, almost mythical name, to anything in her own life. Dukes did not call upon the Calder family. Dukes did not exist, as far as Winifred's daily life was concerned, except as figures mentioned in newspapers and the occasional breathless gossip column. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped into a curtsy that felt absurdly inadequate, performed as it was in a kitchen garden with dirt under her fingernails. Forgive me, I wasn't expecting. That is, I don't believe we've had the pleasure of—" "We have met," he said, "though I would not be surprised if you don't recall it. It was some years ago." Winifred straightened slowly, studying his face, and something in her memory shifted. A half-formed image of a tall young man with a limp, walking the lane near her father's old property, asking after the names of plants, listening to her talk with an attention that had surprised her at the time, because so few people, in her experience, actually listened. "Lord Hugo," she said slowly. The gentleman who was recovering from a riding accident. You were staying at—" She stopped. "But that was 7 years ago." "Yes," he said. "It was." There was something in the way he said it, something careful, almost weighted, that Winifred could not quite interpret. She found herself, absurdly, smoothing her apron, as though that might somehow make her more presentable to a duke who had appeared without warning in her garden on an October morning. "I'm afraid my mother is not yet receiving callers," she said. "If you would care to leave a card, I could—" "I haven't come to call upon your mother," Hugo said. "I've come to call upon you." The words hung in the damp morning air between them. "I beg your pardon." "I realize," Hugo said, and for the first time something in his composed expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something that suggested he was aware of how strange this must seem. "That this is an unconventional manner of introducing the matter. I had intended to write first, to request a formal call through the proper channels with the proper notice. But my father died 3 days ago, and I find that—" He paused, and Winifred saw, with a small shock, that his jaw tightened, as though he were holding something back with effort. "I find that grief makes a man impatient with proper channels." "I'm very sorry for your loss, Your Grace," Winifred said automatically, though her mind was still struggling to catch up with the scene unfolding in front of her. "Thank you." He inclined his head. "Miss Calder, I wonder if I might walk with you for a few minutes? There is something I would like to say to you, and I find I would rather say it without an audience, and without—" He glanced briefly toward the house, where Winifred could see, at the parlour window, the unmistakable shape of her mother's face, watching with an expression of frozen astonishment. "Without complications." Winifred looked back at the house, looked at her mother's face, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember something that was not quite hope, because hope required understanding, and she understood nothing about what was happening. But it was something adjacent to hope, a kind of dizzying, unbalancing curiosity, as though the floor of her life had just tilted slightly, and she could not yet tell whether she was about to fall or about to be caught. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. "There's a path through the orchard. We won't be observed there." "Thank you," he said, and as she came through the garden gate to join him on the lane, she saw something flicker across his face. Relief, she thought, though she could not imagine what a duke would have to be relieved about in the presence of a woman like her. They walked in silence for a few moments, the gravel crunching beneath their feet, the bare branches of the orchard trees forming a grey lattice overhead. Winifred was acutely aware of his presence beside her, not merely his height, though he was tall enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to look at him, but something else, a kind of stillness, a focus, as though every part of his attention was directed at her, and had perhaps been directed at her since the moment he stepped out of the carriage. "You don't remember me well, I think," he said finally, "and that is entirely my doing. I gave you very little reason to remember a man you met 3 times, briefly, on a country lane 7 years ago." "I remember," Winifred said slowly, "that you asked a great many questions, about the herbs mostly, and about—" she hesitated. "You asked about pain, whether it ever stopped." Something in his expression, that careful, controlled expression, cracked, just slightly. "You remember that?" "You seem to need an honest answer," she said. "Most people, when they ask such questions, want to be told what they wish to hear. You didn't. So I told you the truth, which is that pain doesn't stop, generally. It simply becomes something you've learned to carry." "I have thought about that sentence," Hugo said, "more times than I can count in the 7 years since you said it." Winifred stopped walking. He stopped as well and turned to face her, and for the first time she saw something in his expression that was entirely unguarded, a rawness that seemed at odds with everything she had understood in the space of 15 minutes about who this man was supposed to be. The Duke of Penrose. Cold, powerful, untouchable. "Miss Calder," he said, "I am aware that what I am about to say will sound, at best, eccentric, and at worst, deeply improper. I have rehearsed a number of more measured ways of saying it, and I find, now that I am standing here, that none of them feel honest enough. So I'm simply going to say it plainly, and I would ask that you allow me to finish before you respond, because I suspect that if you respond too quickly, you will say no, and I would rather you say no after you have heard the whole of it than before." Winifred's heart was beating very fast. "Your Grace, I don't—" "Please," he said, "just let me finish." She nodded, mute. "7 years ago," he said, "I spent perhaps 30 minutes of my life in conversation with you, across 3 separate occasions, on a country lane in Hampshire. In those 30 minutes you said more true things to me than most people manage to say in a lifetime of acquaintance. You did not know who I was, not really, and so you spoke to me as though I were simply a man, in pain, who deserved an honest answer. No one had ever done that before. No one has done it since." He took a slow breath. "I went back to London. My circumstances changed. My brother died, and I became, eventually, what I am now. And in all the years since, I find that I have thought of you, of that conversation, of the way you looked at me, of the things you said, more than I have thought of anything else in my life. I have asked, quietly, after your circumstances, more times than I am proud to admit. I have known for some time now that your situation here has not been—" He hesitated, choosing the word carefully. "Kind to you." Winifred felt heat rise in her face. "Your Grace, I don't think it's appropriate for you to—" "I know," he said. "I know it isn't appropriate. I know that everything about this is improper, arriving unannounced, speaking to you alone, saying any of this at all. But my father died 3 days ago, Miss Calder, and when a man stands at his father's deathbed, he is given, I think, a particular kind of clarity about how he has spent his life, and how he intends to spend whatever remains of it. And I found, standing there, that I could not bear the thought of spending 1 more year pretending that I did not think of you, that I did not wonder every single day what had become of you, that I did not—" His voice, for the first time, wavered slightly. "That I did not care, more than I have ever cared about anything, whether you were happy." The orchard was very quiet. Somewhere a bird called, sharp and clear, in the grey morning air. "I am not asking you for anything today," Hugo said. "I am not going to ask you to marry me, or to make any promise, or to feel anything at all that you do not already feel. I am simply asking—" And here, for the first time, his composure seemed to genuinely fail him, and Winifred saw, with something like wonder, that his hands, at his sides, were not quite steady. "I am asking whether you would permit me to call upon you, properly, with your mother's knowledge and consent, so that you might come to know me, the man I am now, not merely the man you met on a lane 7 years ago, and decide, in your own time, whether there is anything here worth knowing." Winifred stared at him. She thought of her mother's face at the window. She thought of 6 years of folded linens and mended hems, and the particular quality of silence that fell over a room when she entered it. She thought of being 24 and unmarried, and quietly, permanently filed away in her own family as the daughter who hadn't succeeded. And she thought of a tall young man on a country lane 7 years ago, listening to her talk about pain as though her words mattered. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything today," Hugo said. "Only, may I call? Tomorrow? Or whenever would be convenient. I would like to begin again, properly, this time." And Winifred, standing in the cold orchard with her heart beating very fast and her dirt-stained hands clasped together in front of her, heard herself say, "Yes, yes, Your Grace, you may call." That afternoon, the Calder parlour saw more activity than it had seen in years. Mrs. Calder, having watched from the window as her unmarried, unremarkable daughter walked alone through the orchard with the Duke of Penrose. The Duke of Penrose, whose income, as Mrs. Calder had occasion to mention no fewer than 6 times in the following hour, was rumoured to exceed £40,000 a year, had undergone a transformation so complete that Winifred found it almost dizzying to witness. "Sit up straight, Winifred, and do something about your hair before tomorrow. I'll send for Mrs. Pruitt to dress it properly. And that grey dress simply will not do. We shall have to see what can be done with the blue. Oh, and we must write to Honora at once. She will want to know, she will want to come, though of course there isn't time." "Mother," Winifred said quietly, "he hasn't asked for anything. He asked only to call." Yes, of course to call," Mrs. Calder said, in a tone that suggested she found this distinction entirely beside the point. "But Winifred, my dear girl, a duke does not simply call upon a young woman without reason. Surely you understand what this means." Winifred did not, in fact, fully understand what it meant. She understood that something extraordinary had happened, that a man she barely remembered had stood in an orchard and told her that he had thought of her for 7 years, that he had asked after her, that he had described her words to him as the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. She understood that this had made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, as though she were a person who mattered. But she also understood, because she had learned over 6 years to understand such things very clearly, that her mother's sudden warmth was not, in any sense, for her. It was for what she now represented. The daughter who hadn't succeeded had, in the space of a single morning, become the daughter who might, after all, succeed beyond anything her sisters had managed. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, Winifred thought about the locked, careful expression Hugo had worn when he first arrived, and the way it had cracked, just for a moment, when he spoke of his father's death and of standing at a deathbed and being given clarity. She thought about 11 words he had said, near the end. "I cared, more than I have ever cared about anything. Whether you were happy." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. No one had ever, in her entire life, suggested that her happiness was a thing worth caring about at all. She did not yet know about the locked room at Penrose. She did not yet know about the 11 portraits, or the unsent letters, or the 7 years of careful, quiet watching that had led to this moment. But she fell asleep that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, without the familiar hollow ache of being unseen. And 30 miles away, in a house far grander than any she had ever set foot in, Hugo, Duke of Penrose, stood once again in a locked room, looking at 11 imperfect portraits of a face that he had, that very morning, finally seen again in life. And for the first time in 7 years he allowed himself to feel something he had not permitted himself to feel before. Hope. If you think you know where this story is going, I'd ask you to keep listening, because the next several weeks of Winifred Calder's life were stranger and more complicated than either she or her mother could have anticipated. Hugo called the next day, as promised, and the day after that. And within a fortnight, what had begun as a single, extraordinary morning had become something else entirely, a courtship, conducted with a formality that seemed almost old-fashioned, and watched, Winifred quickly came to understand, by every eye in the county. The Duke of Penrose did not call quietly. He could not. A man of his rank, riding into the same modest village twice a week, taking tea in the same modest parlour, walking the same lanes with the same unmarried young woman, was the sort of event that simply could not pass unnoticed in a community where very little happened. "They're talking about it at the assembly rooms," Theodosia wrote, in a letter that arrived within the week, her clergyman's wife, handwriting somehow managing to convey breathless excitement even on paper. "Mrs. Fenwick says her cousin in Winchester has heard of nothing else for days. Winifred, is it true? The Duke of Penrose?" Honora's letter, when it arrived 2 days later, was rather different in tone. "I do hope," Honora wrote, "that you understand the position you are placing yourself in, Winifred. Men of his rank do not, as a general rule, marry women of our circumstances, not because they are unkind, but because it simply is not done. I would not wish for you to allow yourself to hope for something that may, in the end, amount to nothing more than a duke's passing fancy. I say this only out of concern for you." Winifred read this letter twice, and then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer, and did not mention it to anyone. The truth was, she did not entirely disagree with Honora's caution. There was a part of her, a quiet, careful part, shaped by 6 years of folded linens and lowered expectations, that watched the unfolding courtship with a kind of disbelieving suspicion, as though she were waiting for the moment when someone would explain that it had all been a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken identity, a joke that had gone too far. But there was another part of her, a part that had been silent for so long she had nearly forgotten it existed, that found itself against all caution beginning to hope. Because the truth was, Hugo was not what she had expected a duke to be. He did not speak to her the way the few eligible men of her single season had spoken, with that practiced, performative gallantry that always seemed to be addressed less to her than to whoever else might be listening. He asked her questions and waited for the answers, and seemed genuinely interested in them. He asked about the books she read, and was visibly surprised and then visibly delighted to discover that she had read rather more widely than her circumstances might have suggested, having spent years quietly working through her father's modest library out of nothing more than boredom and curiosity. He asked about her management of the household accounts, a subject her mother considered tedious in the extreme, and listened with what appeared to be genuine interest as she explained the small economies she had learned to practice, the way she had stretched a diminished income to cover 6 years of a household that had once expected far more. "You manage all of this yourself?" he asked, on the 4th or 5th occasion, as they walked the same orchard path where he had first spoken to her. "The accounts, the household, the everything?" "Someone must," Winifred said simply. "My mother finds it tiresome." "And do you find it tiresome?" She considered this. "No," she admitted. "I find it satisfying, I suppose. There is something pleasing about making numbers balance, about knowing precisely where everything stands and what can and cannot be done with what one has." Hugo was quiet for a moment. "Do you know," he said finally, "that is very nearly the opposite of how most people of my acquaintance approach money. Most people of my acquaintance have never had to think about whether numbers balance, because there has always been more money to throw at the problem. I find I have very little patience for it. I would rather spend an afternoon discussing drainage improvements on a tenant farm than an evening at a ball discussing nothing at all." "That seems," Winifred said carefully, "like a rather unusual way for a duke to feel." "Perhaps," Hugo said. "Or perhaps it simply means I have spent too much time around people who never learned what you learned, that there is a kind of dignity in making things balance, even when there isn't very much to balance with." Winifred felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a feeling she did not immediately recognize, because it had been so long since she had felt it. It was the feeling of being understood. Now, it's worth pausing here to consider something that Winifred herself would have encountered almost immediately, the very first time she was driven to Penrose in Hugo's carriage for tea. The sheer scale of a household run at ducal standards, and the rigid hierarchy that governed every person within it. A house like Penrose might employ upward of 30 indoor servants alone, a butler and housekeeper at the top of their respective domains, below them a hierarchy of footmen, ladies' maids, cooks, scullery maids, and so on, each rank governed by strict rules of precedence, address, and even where one was permitted to eat. A duchess did not simply arrive and begin issuing instructions. She inherited an entire functioning society in miniature, one with its own customs and expectations, and a new mistress who failed to understand that society could find her authority quietly, politely, undermined from below stairs for years. For a woman like Winifred, who had spent 6 years managing a household with perhaps 2 servants total, the prospect of one day commanding such a structure was not a small adjustment. It was, in its own way, almost as significant a transformation as the marriage itself. It was at the third dinner party, the first to which Winifred had been invited as something more than an afterthought, on account of the Duke's now widely known interest, that the first real complication arose. The party was held at the home of Sir Reginald and Lady Forsyth, the most prominent family in the immediate neighbourhood, and it was, Winifred understood, something of a test. Lady Forsyth had not previously troubled herself to invite the Calders to anything more significant than the occasional afternoon call. The invitation that now arrived, addressed with unusual warmth to Mrs. Calder and Miss Winifred Calder, was a clear signal that the neighbourhood's assessment of Winifred's social value had undergone a sudden and dramatic revision. Winifred wore the blue dress, properly mended now, the hem fixed by her mother's own hands, an irony Winifred chose not to remark upon, and arrived to find the drawing-room considerably fuller than she had expected, and considerably more attentive to her arrival than she had ever experienced in her life. She also found, seated near the fire and looking entirely at ease in a manner that suggested long familiarity with such gatherings, a woman she did not recognize. "Ah, Miss Calder," Lady Forsyth said with the particular brightness of a hostess orchestrating an introduction she found delicious. "May I present Lady Cressida Thornbury?" "Lady Cressida, this is Miss Winifred Calder, of whom I'm sure you've heard." Lady Cressida turned and smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. "Miss Calder," she said. "Of course, I've heard a great deal." She was, Winifred saw immediately, beautiful in the particular, polished way that took years of careful cultivation. Dark hair arranged in an elaborate style, a gown of deep green silk that fit her perfectly, and a manner that suggested complete confidence in her own place in any room she entered. "Lady Cressida is the daughter of the Earl of Marchwood," Lady Forsyth continued with evident relish. "She and the Duke are old friends. They were practically raised together, weren't they, Lady Cressida? Such a pity his Grace has been so occupied of late. I'm sure you've hardly had a chance to renew your acquaintance." "Hardly any chance at all," Lady Cressida agreed pleasantly, and her eyes moved over Winifred with a slow, assessing thoroughness that made Winifred acutely aware of every imperfection in her dress, her hair, her bearing. "Though I understand his Grace has been very occupied indeed, with Hampshire matters." The way she said Hampshire matters left no doubt as to what, or who, she meant. "Lady Cressida," Lady Forsyth said, lowering her voice in the manner of someone about to impart a delicious confidence, "has been spoken of in some circles as a most natural match for his Grace. Their families have been close for generations. I believe there was even some expectation when they were both quite young that, well," she gave a small significant laugh, "but I am sure that's all ancient history now." "Quite ancient," Lady Cressida said, smiling at Winifred with an expression that was all teeth. "Though I confess, Miss Calder, I am terribly curious. You and his Grace, how did you first become acquainted? I understand it was rather sudden." Winifred felt the eyes of the room on her, not openly, not rudely, but with that particular quality of social attention that felt somehow more invasive than open staring would have been. "His Grace and I are old acquaintances," Winifred said as evenly as she could manage. "We met some years ago, before he held the title." "How charming," Lady Cressida said, "and how convenient that he should have remembered you now that he holds it." The implication was not subtle. Winifred felt her face grow warm, and was aware with a kind of distant horror that her hands had begun to tremble slightly. It was at that moment that Hugo arrived. He had been delayed, some matter of estate business, Winifred understood later, and his entrance into the drawing room produced the kind of immediate, rippling attention that Winifred was beginning to recognize as the inevitable consequence of his rank. But what struck her, what she would remember long afterward, was the speed with which his eyes found her across the crowded room, and the way his expression, composed, controlled, the careful mask he wore in public, shifted, almost imperceptibly, the moment he saw her face. He crossed the room, directly to her side, not to greet his hostess first, as etiquette would have dictated, not to acknowledge the various acquaintances who called out to him as he passed, directly to Winifred. "Miss Calder," he said, and there was something in his voice, a warmth, a focus, that Winifred felt, rather than heard. "Forgive my lateness. I hope you haven't been kept waiting unpleasantly." "Not at all, Your Grace," Winifred said. "Lady Cressida has been most attentive." Something flickered across Hugo's face as his gaze moved to Lady Cressida, and for just a moment Winifred saw something she had not seen before. A coldness, controlled but unmistakable, directed not at her but at the woman beside her. "Cressida," he said, and his tone was perfectly civil and utterly without warmth. "I didn't realize you were in Hampshire." "Lady Forsyth was kind enough to invite me," Lady Cressida said, smiling. "I thought it might be amusing to see the neighborhood that has captured so much of your attention lately. Hugo, I confess I'm rather curious what could possibly have kept you so occupied." "Are you?" Hugo said. It was not a question. There was a brief, charged silence. "Miss Calder," Hugo said, turning back to Winifred, and his voice softened immediately, the coldness gone as though it had never existed. "I wonder if you might do me the honor of allowing me to escort you to dinner. I find I have a great deal to tell you about the drainage improvements we discussed. I've had the surveyor's report, and I think you'll find the figures rather satisfying." It was, Winifred understood, a deliberate and very public act. The Duke of Penrose, in front of the assembled company, in front of Lady Cressida Thornbury, choosing to discuss drainage figures with Winifred Calder rather than continue any conversation with the woman society, had apparently long expected him to marry. "I would like that very much, Your Grace," Winifred said. As he led her toward the dining room, Winifred glanced back once and caught Lady Cressida's expression, and for just a moment before the mask of pleasant social composure slid back into place, she saw something there that frightened her. It was not merely disappointment. It was rage. That night, lying awake, Winifred found herself turning the evening over and over in her mind. The dinner itself had passed pleasantly enough. Hugo had indeed discussed drainage at some length, and had drawn her into a conversation about it that left her feeling again that strange and unfamiliar sensation of being genuinely listened to. But beneath the pleasantness of the evening, she had felt something else, the unmistakable sense that she had become, without any choice of her own, a combatant in a battle she did not fully understand. They were practically raised together, Lady Forsyth had said, some expectation, when they were both quite young. Winifred did not know what history existed between Hugo and Lady Cressida Thornbury. She did not know whether there had been an understanding, an expectation, anything that might give Lady Cressida a legitimate claim to feel wronged. She knew only that the woman's beauty, her confidence, her evident familiarity with a world that Winifred had only briefly glimpsed during one disastrous season, all of it stood in stark, painful contrast to everything Winifred was not. He could have anyone, she thought, staring at the ceiling. He could have a woman like that, beautiful, titled, raised in his world, familiar with everything he knows. And instead he is here, in Hampshire, discussing drainage with a woman whose own mother considers her a disappointment. Why? It was a question she did not yet know how to ask him. But she found, as the days passed, that it began to sit at the back of her mind. A small, persistent doubt, even as the courtship continued, even as Hugo's attentions remained constant, even as her mother's warmth grew daily more effusive, and the neighbourhood's opinion of Miss Calder continued its dizzying transformation. The midpoint came nearly 6 weeks after Hugo's first visit, on an afternoon when a sudden, violent autumn storm trapped them both, quite by accident, in the small folly at the edge of the Calder property, a half-ruined garden structure that had once, decades ago, been intended as a summer retreat and was now mostly used for storing garden tools. They had been walking when the rain began. Not a gentle rain, but a sudden, drenching downpour that arrived with almost no warning, and they had run for the folly, laughing despite themselves, and arrived soaked through and breathless, and found themselves quite suddenly alone together in a small stone room with rain hammering on the roof and no possibility of leaving for some time. "This is," Hugo said, looking around at the dusty interior, the cobwebbed corners, the single narrow window through which the grey stormlight filtered, "rather less grand than the venues I am accustomed to." "I'm afraid the Calder family does not maintain its follies to ducal standards," Winifred said, and was rewarded by the sight of Hugo laughing. A real laugh, unguarded, that she had not heard before, and that transformed his face entirely. They sat, eventually, on an old wooden bench against the wall, close enough that Winifred could feel the warmth of him through her damp sleeve, and for a while neither of them spoke. The rain continued. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled, distant and low. "Miss Calder," Hugo said finally, his voice quieter than she had heard it before, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "That day in the orchard, the day I first called, you said yes. You agreed to let me call upon you properly so that you might come to know me." He was looking at his hands, not at her. "I have wondered in the weeks since whether you have come to any conclusions about whether there is anything here worth knowing." Winifred was quiet for a long moment. "Your Grace," she said finally, "may I ask you something first?" He looked at her. "Of course." "Lady Cressida Thornberry," Winifred said carefully. "Lady Forsyth said that your families were close, that there had been some expectation, when you were both young, of a match between you." Something shifted in Hugo's expression. Not surprise, exactly, but a kind of resigned acknowledgement, as though he had been waiting for this question and was relieved, in a way, that it had finally come. "Yes," he said. "There was. Our fathers discussed it when Cressida and I were children. It was the sort of arrangement that families like ours often discuss, long before either party has any say in the matter. Nothing was ever formally agreed, but it was understood by both families, by Cressida certainly." "And by you?" Hugo turned then and looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression, an honesty, a willingness to be seen, that Winifred had not encountered from anyone, ever, in her life. "I never wanted it," he said simply. "Not because there is anything wrong with Cressida. She is, in many ways, exactly what someone in my position is supposed to want. Beautiful, well-connected, raised to manage a household like mine without difficulty. But I never felt, in all the years of that understanding, anything that resembled what I am meant to feel for the woman I marry. I felt nothing. An absence. The understanding simply existed, unaddressed, year after year, because no one forced the question, and I had no reason to force it myself." "And now?" "And now," Hugo said, "I have a reason." The rain continued. Winifred found that she had stopped breathing, very slightly, and made herself start again. "Winifred," Hugo said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice did something to her chest that she could not have described. "I am aware that what I am about to say is, again, premature. I am aware that we have known each other, in any real sense, for only a matter of weeks. I am not going to ask you anything today that you are not ready to answer. But I want you to understand something because I think it matters, and because I have spent 7 years not saying things I should have said, and I am done with that. He took her hand, gently, carefully, as though it were something precious. And Winifred did not pull away. "There is no one else," Hugo said. "There has never been anyone else. Not Cressida, not any of the dozen other women my mother and various well-meaning relations have suggested to me over the years. There has only ever been you, a memory of you, for 7 years, and now the reality of you, which is, if anything, more than the memory ever was. I don't know what you feel. I don't know if you feel anything at all beyond the natural curiosity of finding oneself suddenly, strangely, the object of a duke's attention. But I wanted you to know what I feel, because I think you deserve to know it, whatever you decide to do with it." Winifred looked down at her hand in his, at his fingers, long and careful, wrapped around hers, and felt something break open inside her chest, something that had been closed for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "I have spent 6 years," she said very quietly, "being told in every way that does not involve actual words that I am the disappointing daughter, the one who didn't succeed, the one who will, in all likelihood, spend the rest of her life managing her mother's household accounts and being quietly, politely overlooked at every gathering she attends. I had made my peace with that, Your Grace. I had decided that it was simply who I was going to be." She looked up at him. "And then you arrived in a black carriage on an ordinary October morning and told me that you had thought of me for 7 years. And I find that I do not know how to make peace with that. I do not know how to simply accept it, as though it were ordinary, as though it were the kind of thing that happens to women like me." "It is not ordinary," Hugo said. "Nothing about this is ordinary, but Winifred—" His thumb moved very gently against the back of her hand. "I would like it to become yours, if you'll let it." The rain was beginning to slow. Through the narrow window, the grey light was shifting, brightening slightly as the storm moved on. Winifred did not answer with words. She found instead that she leaned very slightly, very slowly toward him, and that he met her just as slowly, and for a moment, just a moment, their faces were close enough that she could feel his breath warm against her cheek, and she thought, with a kind of dizzying clarity, "This is it. This is the moment. This is—" The folly door banged open. "Your Grace, Miss Calder!" One of the Penrose grooms stood in the doorway, soaked through, clearly having run the entire distance from wherever he had been sheltering. "Forgive the intrusion. The carriage is ready. The storm's passing. Mrs. Calder sent word she was concerned." Hugo and Winifred drew apart. Both of them, Winifred thought, rather faster than was strictly necessary, and for a moment neither of them could quite meet the other's eyes. "Thank you, Davies," Hugo said, his voice rather more controlled than his expression. "We'll come directly." As they walked back toward the house, at a respectable distance from one another now, the moment having passed, the storm having passed, Winifred found herself thinking, with a small private smile that she could not quite suppress, that she had very nearly been kissed by a duke in a half-ruined garden folly, and that some part of her, some part she had thought long dead, was disappointed that she hadn't been. She did not yet know that, less than a mile away, in the drawing-room of Sir Reginald and Lady Forsyth's house, Lady Cressida Thornbury had spent the afternoon of the storm in a very different sort of conversation, one that involved a letter addressed to Mrs. Calder, and a piece of information that Lady Cressida had spent the better part of 2 days carefully, deliberately uncovering. Information about Winifred's father, about the true circumstances of his death, and about a debt, old, nearly forgotten, but very much still legally enforceable, that, if revealed at the wrong moment, in the wrong way, could destroy everything. Now I should pause here and explain something, Because what happens next in this story hinges on a piece of history that modern audiences often find difficult to credit: the sheer, total power that debt held over a family's reputation in this period. In 1854, a debt was not simply a private financial matter between two parties. It was a matter of honor, and honor, for a family like the Calders, was the only currency that truly mattered, because it was the thing that determined whether one's daughters could be received in respectable houses, whether one's name could be spoken without a particular knowing inflection, whether one existed, socially, at all. A debt left unpaid, particularly a debt connected to something shameful, something that suggested a man had died not merely poor, but dishonorably poor, could destroy a family's standing more thoroughly than almost anything else, because unlike a scandal involving a person, a debt could be documented, proven, waived quite literally in the form of paper, in front of an entire drawing room. Lady Cressida Thornbury had spent 2 days and a not inconsiderable sum of her own pin money, ensuring that she had exactly such a piece of paper. The letter arrived at the Calder house 3 days after the storm, addressed not to Winifred, but to Mrs. Calder. And it was, Winifred would later learn, written in a hand that had been very carefully disguised, though the perfume on the paper, faint but unmistakable, told its own story to anyone who had stood close enough to Lady Cressida Thornbury to know her scent. Winifred was in the garden when her mother summoned her, not with the usual querulous call, but with something sharper, more urgent, a tone Winifred had not heard from her mother in years. She found Mrs. Calder in the parlour, standing rather than sitting, with a letter clutched in one hand and an expression on her face that Winifred had never seen before. Not disappointment, not the cold, withdrawn dissatisfaction that had characterized so much of Winifred's life in this house. Fear. "Mother? What's happened?" "Sit down," Mrs. Calder said. "Mother." "Sit down, Winifred." Winifred sat. Mrs. Calder read the letter aloud, her voice flat and careful, in a way that suggested enormous effort. It informed Mrs. Calder anonymously, but with a precision that left no doubt as to its accuracy, that the late Mr. Calder had, in the final year of his life, incurred a substantial debt to a moneylender in London, that this debt had never been repaid in his lifetime, because Mr. Calder had died before it came due, and the family, in the chaos of his death and the subsequent contraction of their finances, had either not known of it, or had quietly hoped it might be forgotten. It had not been forgotten. By the time it was finally settled, a year after Mr. Calder's death, interest had swelled the debt to a sum that the Calder family could never, in any circumstance, have repaid themselves. And the letter made clear, in carefully neutral language, that nonetheless carried an unmistakable threat, that a record of this once staggering unpaid debt had recently come into the possession of certain parties who might find it advantageous to make it known, particularly if certain other matters of a more personal nature did not proceed in a manner those parties found acceptable. "What does it mean?" Winifred asked, though some cold, sinking part of her had already understood. "What other matters?" Mrs. Calder looked at her daughter, and for the first time in Winifred's memory, her mother's composure, that careful, withholding composure that had defined every interaction between them for 6 years, cracked entirely. "It means," Mrs. Calder said, "that someone wants this courtship to end, and that if it doesn't, your father's name and this family's name will be dragged through every drawing room in 3 counties. We will be ruined, Winifred, not merely embarrassed, ruined. Honora's husband holds a position that depends on respectability. Theodosia's husband is a clergyman. A scandal touching his wife's family could cost him his living entirely. And you—" Mrs. Calder's voice broke. "You would be remembered for the rest of your life as the daughter whose father died a debtor and who brought disgrace upon her entire family by pursuing a duke she had no business pursuing. "I didn't pursue him," Winifred said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, even as something inside her felt as though it were collapsing. "He came to me." "It doesn't matter who came to whom," Mrs. Calder said. "It only matters what can be said. And what can be said, Winifred, is that a duke was made a fool of by a family hiding a debtor's shame, and that the woman he nearly married was complicit in that deception." Winifred sat very still. "You must end it," Mrs. Calder said. "You must tell the Duke that you cannot continue the acquaintance. You needn't explain why, simply that you've reconsidered, that you don't wish to proceed. He'll be disappointed, perhaps, but he'll recover. Men like that always do. And this," she gestured at the letter, "this will go away. Whoever sent this has no interest in destroying us, only in ending the match. If the match ends, the threat ends." "And if I don't?" "Then everything is destroyed," Mrs. Calder said simply. "Everything. Not just your prospects, Winifred, everyone's. Your sisters, their husbands, their children, all of it, because of a debt your father never told any of us about, and a duke's attention that none of us asked for." That night, Winifred did not sleep at all. She thought about Hugo, about the way he had looked at her in the orchard, in the folly, the careful unguardedness of his expression when he spoke of 7 years of thinking about her. She thought about his hand around hers, his thumb moving gently against her skin, the warmth of his breath in the moment before the door had banged open and interrupted them. And she thought about Honora's children, who adored their father, who knew nothing of debts or scandals or the precariousness of respectability. She thought about Theodosia's husband, standing in his pulpit each Sunday, his living dependent on a congregation's good opinion. She thought about her mother, cold, withholding, often unkind, but also, Winifred realized with a kind of distant clarity, frightened, and had perhaps been frightened for years in ways Winifred had never fully understood, about a precariousness that Winifred's own courtship had now made suddenly, catastrophically visible. She did not know who had sent the letter. She suspected, though she had no proof, that it traced back to Lady Cressida Thornbury and the rage she had seen in that woman's eyes at the Forsyths' prize dinner party. But it did not matter in the end who had sent it. What mattered was that the threat was real, and that Winifred was the only person who could remove it. She wrote the letter to Hugo before dawn, by candlelight, and she wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied that it said what it needed to say without revealing anything that might allow him to fight it. "Your Grace," she wrote, "I have given a great deal of thought to our acquaintance and to the kindness you have shown me these past weeks. I am grateful for it, more grateful than I can easily express. But I have come to believe that a continued acquaintance between us would not be wise for either of us, and I must ask that you not call again. I am sorry that I cannot offer a fuller explanation. Please believe that this decision causes me a great deal of sorrow, and that it is not made lightly or because of any want of regard on my part. I wish you every happiness, Your Grace, and I hope you will not think too unkindly of me. Winifred Calder." She sent it by the early post before her mother woke, and then she went to her room and closed the door and sat by the cold fireplace until the sun came up. Hugo received the letter at Penrose 2 days later, and Mr. Aldous, who had served as his secretary for 11 years and had never once seen his employer display any emotion stronger than mild irritation, would later describe what happened next as the worst hour of my professional life, and I include in that assessment the year we discovered the extent of the late Duke's gambling debts. Hugo read the letter once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down on his desk, very carefully, as though it might shatter, and sat in silence for so long that Mr. Aldous, who had been waiting to discuss a matter of tenant leases, eventually withdrew without saying anything at all. For 3 days, Hugo did not leave Penrose. He did not eat, beyond what his valet practically forced upon him. He sat, for hours at a time in the locked room with the 11 portraits, staring at 11 imperfect versions of Winifred Calder's face, and he tried and failed repeatedly to understand what had happened. The letter made no sense, not the words themselves, which were polite and final and, on their surface, perfectly clear. But the tone. Hugo had spent 6 weeks learning the particular cadences of Winifred's voice, the directness with which she spoke, the way she never used more words than necessary, and never softened a truth simply to make it more palatable. And this letter was nothing like that. It was careful, evasive, apologetic in a way that felt, to Hugo's ear, almost performed. "I must ask that you not call again," she had written. But she had not written, "I do not wish you to call again." And to a man who had spent 7 years cataloguing every word Winifred Calder had ever said to him, the distinction was not small. Something had happened. Something had frightened her, or threatened her, or forced her hand. And Hugo, who had spent 7 years being careful, being patient, being a man who watched from a distance and never acted, found himself, on the 3rd day, standing in front of the locked room's window, looking out toward Hampshire and making a different kind of decision. He was not going to simply accept this, not without understanding why. But he also understood, because for all his years of careful watching, he understood Winifred better than perhaps even he realized. That if she had written this letter under duress, then arriving at her door and demanding an explanation would only make whatever situation she was in worse. If someone had threatened her or her family, then the threat would not disappear simply because Hugo refused to honor it. It would simply find another way to be carried out. So Hugo did something that surprised even himself. He waited, and while he waited, he began, quietly, carefully, using every resource his position afforded him, to find out exactly what had happened. The weeks that followed were, for both of them, a kind of slow unraveling. For Winifred, the days settled back into their old rhythm with a speed that felt almost obscene. The folded linens, the household accounts, her mother's careful, withholding silences, all of it exactly as it had been before, as though the 6 weeks of Hugo's courtship had been a fever dream from which she had now painfully woken. Mrs. Calder did not speak of the letter, or of Hugo, or of anything related to the events of the past months. The Forsyths' invitations stopped arriving. The neighborhood's brief, dizzying reassessment of Miss Calder reversed itself with the same speed it had arrived, and Winifred found herself, once again, a woman whom no one troubled to notice. But it was worse now than it had been before. Because before, Winifred had not known what it felt like to be looked at, truly looked at, the way Hugo had looked at her, with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in her life, like a person who mattered. And now that she knew what that felt like, its absence was not merely a continuation of her old life. It was a wound. She found that she could not walk in the orchard anymore, because every path reminded her of conversations that no longer existed. She found that she could not look at the blue dress without thinking of the dinner party, of Lady Cressida's smile, of the moment in the Folly when she had leaned toward Hugo and felt his breath against her cheek and believed for one suspended second that her life was about to change. She grew thinner. She slept badly. Her mother, watching her with an expression that Winifred could not quite read, something that might, in a different woman, have been guilt, said nothing, because there was nothing that could be said that would not require acknowledging what had been done, and why. For Hugo, the unraveling took a different form, though it was no less complete. He took to spending his evenings in the locked room, the room that had for 7 years been a private refuge, a place of quiet hope. Now it became something else. He would sit on the narrow window seat beneath the 11 portraits, often until the candles burned down entirely, staring at 11 painted versions of a face he had been told, in careful, final language he was not permitted to see again. His valet, bringing supper trays that went untouched, learned to leave them on the small table outside the door without knocking, because knocking produced no answer, and entering uninvited had once produced a response so uncharacteristically sharp that the man had not attempted it twice. He continued his duties, the estate business, the tenant matters, the endless correspondence that came with his title. But those who worked closely with him began to notice a change. The careful control that had always characterized him became something sharper, more brittle. He slept even less than usual, and when he did sleep, it was sometimes in the chair in the locked room itself, his neck stiff and his eyes shadowed by mourning, as though he could not bear to be anywhere in the house that did not contain some image of her. He stopped entirely, attending any social engagement that did not require his presence, and on the rare occasions when his presence was unavoidable, he was, by all accounts, so coldly civil that even those accustomed to his reserve found it unsettling. Mr. Aldous, who had spent 2 weeks quietly, discreetly making inquiries on his employer's behalf, inquiries Hugo had requested without explanation, but which Aldous, after 11 years of service, had no difficulty interpreting, finally came to him on a grey morning with a small bundle of papers and an expression of careful neutrality. "Your Grace," he said, "I believe I've found what you were looking for." What Aldous had found was this: a moneylender's ledger showing a debt incurred by the late Mr. Calder 8 years prior, a debt that, within a year of being incurred, had already grown substantially with interest, and that Aldous' inquiries suggested had, in fact, been quietly settled in full not long after by a payment from an anonymous source. The debt, in other words, no longer legally existed. It had been paid 6 years ago at the swollen sum the original ledger recorded. But, and this was the detail that made Hugo go very still as he read it, a second copy of the original, unpaid ledger entry had recently been requested and obtained through an intermediary by a woman matching the description of Lady Cressida Thornbury's lady's maid. "She had it settled," Hugo said slowly, "years ago. Someone settled this debt years ago, before Cressida ever obtained a copy of the original record." "It would appear so, Your Grace." "Who settled it?" Aldous hesitated. "The payment was made anonymously, Your Grace, through a London solicitor. The solicitor's records show only that the payment was authorized by—" He glanced down at the paper. "By the late Duke, your father." Hugo sat very still. "My father," he repeated. "It would appear, Your Grace, that the late Duke became aware of the debt some years ago, I cannot say how, and quietly arranged for its settlement. The family was never informed. The debt was simply resolved, without their knowledge." Hugo sat back in his chair, and for a long moment said nothing at all. His father, cold, distant, a man Hugo had spent most of his life believing cared for nothing beyond his own comfort and the maintenance of his title, had at some point quietly paid off a debt belonging to a family his son had never even mentioned to him. A family Hugo had asked after, carefully, casually, for 7 years, in letters his father might easily have seen, might easily have understood the significance of, even if Hugo himself had never explained it. He knew, Hugo thought. He knew, and he never said anything. He simply made certain that whatever I cared about would not be destroyed by something he could quietly fix. It was, Hugo realized, the closest thing to an expression of love his father had ever offered him. And it meant that the debt itself, the thing that had apparently been used to threaten the Calder family, to force Winifred's hand, was no longer real. It was a ghost, a piece of paper with no legal weight behind it, wielded by Lady Cressida Thornbury as though it were a loaded weapon, when in fact it was empty. Hugo stood up so quickly that his chair scraped backward across the floor. "Aldous," he said, "I need the carriage, and I need you to send word to Sir Reginald Forsyth. I require the use of his ballroom 3 days from now for a gathering. Tell him it's a matter of some urgency and that I will explain when I arrive. And Aldous," he paused, his hand on the door, "I will also need a complete and certified copy of the settlement record, every document. I want there to be no possible question, when the time comes, about what is true and what is not." "Of course, Your Grace. May I ask, what is the occasion for the gathering?" Hugo's expression for the first time in weeks was not cold at all. "The occasion," he said, "is that I intend to correct a misunderstanding, publicly and thoroughly." But before any of that could happen, before the gathering, before the documents, before what would become, in the retelling, the single most talked-about evening Hampshire society had seen in a generation, there was the matter of the carriage accident. It happened on the road between the Calder house and the village, on an afternoon 3 days before Hugo's planned gathering, and it happened because Lady Cressida Thornbury, having received word, through channels she had cultivated specifically for this purpose, that the Duke of Penrose was making inquiries that threatened to expose her, had made one final, desperate attempt to ensure that Winifred Calder would not live to see whatever Hugo Penrose was planning. Winifred had been walking to the village to post a letter, an ordinary errand, one she had performed 100 times. When the carriage came around the bend, too fast, far too fast for the narrow lane, and Winifred, hearing the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wheels, had only a moment to throw herself toward the hedge before the carriage clipped the very spot where she had been standing, the wheel passing close enough that she felt the wind of it against her skirts, and then she was falling into the hedge, brambles tearing at her hands and face, and the carriage did not stop, did not even slow, but continued on around the next bend, and was gone. Winifred lay in the hedge for a long moment, her heart pounding, her hands bleeding from the brambles, and then she became aware of a sound. Hoofbeats again, but different this time. A single horse, ridden hard, and she looked up to see Hugo, on horseback, riding toward her at a speed that seemed, in the moment, almost impossible. His face white with a fear that she had never seen on him before. He was off the horse before it had fully stopped, and at her side, and his hands, careful, urgent, shaking very slightly, were on her face, her shoulders, checking her for injury with an intensity that left no room for propriety, for distance, for any of the careful boundaries that had governed every interaction between them. "Winifred, Winifred, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me you're not hurt." I'm well, I think, only the carriage, it nearly—" "I saw it," Hugo said, and his voice was not steady at all. "I saw the whole thing from the rise. I was riding to call on you, despite everything. I couldn't. I saw the carriage, and I saw you, and I thought—" He did not finish the sentence. He simply pulled her against him, his arms around her, his face pressed into her hair, and Winifred felt him shaking. This man who had been described to her by everyone who had ever spoken of him as cold, as controlled, as untouchable. And she understood, in that moment, with a clarity that cut through everything else, that whatever else was true or untrue about her life, about her family situation, about the impossible tangle of debts and threats and letters that had separated them, this much was real. "I received your letter," Hugo said, his voice rough against her hair. "And I did not call, because I thought you wanted me to respect your wishes, even though every part of me knew it didn't sound like you, didn't sound like anything you would actually say if you were free to say it. And I have spent 3 weeks finding out why you wrote it. And Winifred—" He pulled back, just enough to look at her face, and his eyes were wet, and Winifred had never seen anything like it, not from him, not from anyone. "The debt is a lie. It was paid years ago, by my father. There is nothing left for anyone to threaten you with, nothing at all." Winifred stared at him. "The debt was paid. Years ago. My father knew, somehow, and he settled it, quietly, and never told anyone. Lady Cressida Thornbury obtained a copy of the original unpaid record and used it to threaten you and your family, hoping it would end our acquaintance before it became something she couldn't undo. But the threat was empty, Winifred. It was always empty. And whoever sent that carriage at you just now? His jaw tightened, and the coldness Winifred had glimpsed once before at the dinner party returned to his face, sharper and more dangerous than ever. Whoever sent that carriage has just made a mistake that I intend to make certain they regret for the rest of their life. The Forsyths' ballroom had not seen a gathering of this size in years. Word had spread in the particular lightning-fast way that word spread in a small society that the Duke of Penrose had requested the use of the room for a matter of some urgency, and curiosity alone had ensured that nearly every family of consequence in 3 counties found a reason to attend. Winifred stood near the edge of the room, in a gown that was not the blue dress this time. Hugo had sent it 2 days before with a note that said, "Only, I hope you will allow me this. There is something I would like you to wear for what comes next." A deep grey-green silk, the exact colour of his eyes, with a simplicity of cut that made every other gown in the room look, by comparison, slightly overdone. She had not seen him since the road. In the days since the accident, he had sent word through Aldous that he was attending to certain matters, and that he would explain everything at the gathering, and that she should trust him. She did. It was, she reflected, a strange thing to realize, that somewhere in the past 2 months, despite everything, despite the letter she had written and the weeks of silence that had followed, she had come to trust this man more completely than she had ever trusted anyone in her life. The room was full. Lady Cressida Thornbury stood near the centre of it, in crimson silk, laughing at something Sir Reginald had said, looking entirely at ease, and Winifred saw with a small, cold shock that Mrs. Calder stood not far away, her face pale, her eyes moving constantly toward the door. She knows, Winifred thought. She knows something is about to happen. The doors opened, and the room's chatter died almost instantly as the Duke of Penrose entered. He did not pause for the usual formalities. He walked directly into the centre of the room, and the assembled company parted before him with the particular instinctive deference that great wealth and rank commanded, and he stopped, finally, in a position that placed him equidistant between Lady Cressida Thornbury and Winifred, visible to both and to everyone else in the room. "Thank you all for coming," he said, and his voice, pitched to carry without seeming to strain, reached every corner of the silent ballroom. "I'm aware that this gathering was called with very little notice, and I appreciate your indulgence. I will not keep you long. But there is a matter I wish to address, publicly and completely, because I have learned in recent weeks that certain falsehoods have been allowed to circulate in this neighbourhood, and I find I am no longer willing to allow them to stand uncorrected." A murmur ran through the room. Lady Cressida's smile did not waver, but Winifred, watching closely, saw something tighten at the corners of her eyes. "Some weeks ago," Hugo continued, "a letter arrived at the Calder residence, anonymous, but carefully constructed, informing Mrs. Calder that her late husband had died with an outstanding debt to a London moneylender. The letter implied that this information, if it became known, would bring scandal and ruin upon the Calder family. And it suggested, none too subtly, that this scandal might be avoided if a certain acquaintance between myself and Miss Winifred Calder were to come to an end." He paused and let the silence stretch, and Winifred saw several people in the room glance, almost involuntarily, toward Lady Cressida. "I want to be entirely clear about several facts," Hugo said. "First, the debt in question was real. Mr. Calder did, in fact, incur it some 8 years ago, under circumstances that I have no wish to discuss, as they reflect no dishonour on his family, and are, in any case, no one's business but his own. Second, that debt, by then swollen considerably with interest, was settled in full 6 years ago by an anonymous benefactor. I have here—" he held up a folder of documents, which Aldous, standing near the door, had carried in, "certified copies of the settlement, the receipt, and the solicitor's records confirming that the debt has not existed, in any legal sense, for 6 years. Any suggestion that the Calder family carries an outstanding obligation is, and has been for 6 years, entirely false." He let this settle, and then continued, his voice growing colder. "Third, someone in this room obtained a copy of the original unpaid record, a record that has had no legal force for 6 years, and used it to threaten a respectable family with public ruin in order to manipulate a private matter that was, frankly, none of their concern. I know who did this. I have proof of how it was done, who was paid to do it, and when. And I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what kind of person would do such a thing, would threaten the ruin of an entire family, including 2 married women with children, an entire generation of innocent people, simply to satisfy a personal grievance." Lady Cressida's composure, for the first time, cracked entirely. "I'm sure I don't know what your Grace is implying," she said, her voice sharper than before. "But I would caution against making accusations you cannot—" "I can," Hugo said, and his voice was very quiet now, and somehow more terrifying for its quiet. "I have a signed statement from your lady's maid, Lady Cressida, describing how she was instructed and paid to obtain a copy of the original ledger entry from a clerk in London, and to deliver an anonymous letter to Mrs. Calder. I have a statement from the clerk, confirming the transaction and the payment. And I have—" His eyes moved deliberately to a man standing near the back of the room, whom Winifred did not recognize, but who suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. A statement from the driver of a hired carriage describing how he was paid, 3 days ago, to drive at speed along the lane between the Calder residence and the village, at a time when he was told Miss Calder would be walking there. He did not know what was intended. When he realized what had nearly happened, he came forward, because, unlike the woman who hired him, he discovered he could not live with what he had nearly done. The silence in the room was total. "You tried to have her killed," Hugo said, and his voice, for the first time, was not quiet at all. "Because a courtship that was never yours to claim did not end the way you wished it to. Because a woman whose only crime was being seen, finally, after years of being overlooked, became something you could not bear to witness." "This is absurd," Lady Cressida said, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "You cannot possibly, on the word of a maid, a hired driver—" "I can," Hugo said, "and I have. The documents are with my solicitor, and copies have already been sent to your father, the Earl of Marchwood, along with a full account of what has been discovered. I imagine he will have a great deal to say to you, Lady Cressida, about the consequences of attempted murder, even unsuccessful murder, when it becomes known. And it will become known. Every person in this room has just heard it." Lady Cressida looked around the ballroom, at the faces turned toward her, at the expressions ranging from shock to disgust to a kind of horrified fascination. And Winifred saw, in that moment, something break in the other woman's face. Not remorse. Something closer to disbelief. The disbelief of a woman who had spent her entire life moving through the world with the absolute confidence that her rank, her beauty, her connections would always protect her from consequence, and who was discovering, in front of everyone she had ever known, that this was no longer true. "You will regret this," she said to Hugo, her voice shaking. "All of you. You will regret—" "I rather think," Hugo said, "that the regret will be entirely yours." Lady Cressida turned and walked, not ran, though Winifred thought she might have wanted to, toward the doors, and the room parted for her, and no one spoke to her, no one acknowledged her, and Winifred understood that she was watching, in real time, the complete and total social destruction of a woman who had, until 10 minutes ago, occupied one of the highest positions in the room. The doors closed behind her. "Now," Hugo said, and his voice, when he spoke again, had changed entirely. The coldness gone, replaced by something warmer, something that made Winifred's heart begin to pound for an entirely different reason. "There is one more matter I wish to address." He turned and walked across the room and stopped in front of Winifred, and the entire ballroom watched in absolute silence as the Duke of Penrose went down on one knee in front of Winifred Calder. "Miss Calder," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried in the silence. "6 weeks ago, I told you that I was not asking you for anything, that I simply wanted the chance to know you properly and for you to decide, in your own time, whether there was anything here worth knowing. I have spent the weeks since then more certain than I have ever been of anything in my life that the answer is yes. I am not asking you to decide quickly or under any obligation. But I find I cannot wait any longer to ask the question I should have asked the moment I saw you again." He took her hand. "Winifred Calder, will you marry me?" The ballroom, which had been silent, somehow became more silent, the kind of silence that exists only in the half-second before something irreversible happens. Winifred looked down at Hugo, at this man who had watched her for 7 years, who had kept 11 portraits in a locked room, who had stood up in front of every person of consequence in 3 counties and destroyed a woman who had tried to kill her, and who was now kneeling in front of her, in front of everyone, his composure entirely gone, his eyes, those pale grey-green eyes that she had recognized, somehow, the very first moment she saw them, full of nothing but hope. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Hugo, I will." The ballroom erupted. Now, I think it's worth pausing here for a moment, because what Winifred had just agreed to was not, in 1854, simply a romantic matter. It was a profound legal transformation, and one that modern listeners often don't fully appreciate. Under the laws of coverture, which governed marriage in England at this time, a woman's entire legal identity was absorbed into her husband's upon her wedding day. Any property she owned, any income she might earn, even her own legal existence as a person capable of entering contracts or owning anything in her own name, all of it ceased the moment she said her vows and became her husband's instead. For most women, this was simply the unremarkable shape of marriage, the water they swam in. But it meant that the choice Winifred was making in that ballroom was not merely a choice of who. It was a choice that would define, completely and irrevocably, the entire legal shape of the rest of her life. That she was making this choice freely, to a man who had spent 7 years ensuring she would never again feel unseen, mattered enormously, because for so many women in her position, that choice was never truly a choice at all. I have to pause here and tell you something. When I first wrote this scene, the proposal, in front of everyone, after everything that had happened, I found myself genuinely moved in a way I didn't expect. There's something about a person who has spent their whole life being overlooked, finally being seen, completely, publicly, undeniably, that I think speaks to something all of us carry. I hope it landed for you the way it landed for me. The wedding took place 6 weeks later at the small parish church near the Calder house, and it was, by every account, one of the most talked-about events the county had seen in years, not merely because of the rank of the groom, but because of everything that had led up to it, which had by now been told and retold so many times that several versions bore only a passing resemblance to what had actually happened. But before the wedding, 2 days before, in fact, Hugo took Winifred to Penrose for the first time and showed her the locked room. He had warned her beforehand that there was something he needed to show her, something he had never shown anyone, and that he was afraid of how she might react to it. Winifred, walking beside him down a long corridor in the great house that would, in 2 days, become her home, found herself unexpectedly nervous, though she could not have said why. Hugo stopped in front of a door and took a key from his pocket, and his hand, she noticed, was not quite steady. "I need you to understand something before you see this," he said. "What I'm about to show you might seem strange, even disturbing. I have asked myself many times over the years whether it was a sign of something unhealthy in me, an obsession rather than a love. I still don't entirely know the answer, but I want you to see it because I think you deserve to know everything about what these 7 years actually were for me, and because I would rather you know and decide what you think of me with full knowledge than spend our marriage wondering what else I might be hiding." He opened the door. The room beyond was not large, perhaps the size of a small sitting room, and it contained very little furniture. What it contained, instead, covering nearly every wall from floor to ceiling, were portraits, 11 of them. Winifred walked slowly into the room and turned, taking in what surrounded her, and felt something in her chest constrict so tightly she could barely breathe. Each portrait was different poses, different settings, different styles, as though painted by different artists at different times. But each one was unmistakably, recognizably her. Or rather, Winifred realized, walking closer to examine them, each one was an attempt to be her. And each one fell short in ways that were, she understood, with a sudden, overwhelming rush of feeling, deeply, achingly human. In one, her eyes were the wrong color, too blue, not the grey they actually were. In another, her hair was styled in a manner she had never worn it, because the artist, working from a description 7 years out of date, had imagined her as she might have grown to look, rather than as she actually had. In a third, her expression was wrong entirely, too soft, too simpering. Nothing like the directness that Hugo had told her in the orchard was the thing he remembered most. "I commissioned the first one," Hugo said quietly from the doorway. "Perhaps 8 months after I left Hampshire, I described you, as best I could remember, to an artist in London. When it was finished, I looked at it, and I knew immediately that it was wrong. Not badly painted, simply wrong, in ways I couldn't entirely articulate. So I commissioned another, and then another. I kept telling myself that the next one would be the one that finally captured—" He stopped. "I don't know what I thought it would capture. Not your face, exactly. Something else. The way you looked at me. The way you spoke to me as though I was simply a person, not a title." Winifred stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 11 imperfect versions of herself, and felt tears beginning to fall, though she could not have said in that moment whether they were tears of sorrow or something else entirely. 11 portraits, she said softly. 11 attempts. Over 7 years to remember a woman you spoke to for 30 minutes. "I know how it sounds," Hugo said. "It sounds," Winifred said, turning to look at him, "like the loneliest thing I have ever heard." Hugo's expression, careful, controlled even now, seemed to crumble slightly. "I was so afraid," he said, "that you would think it was frightening, that you would think I was frightening, a man who keeps a locked room full of portraits of a woman he spoke to once, 7 years ago. Hugo." Winifred crossed the room and took his hands. "I spent 6 years in a house where I was so completely unseen that I began to wonder if I existed at all, if anything about me was worth noticing, worth remembering, worth keeping. And you spent 7 years trying, again and again, to remember every detail of 30 minutes you spent with me, because you couldn't bear to let it go." She looked around at the portraits, at 11 imperfect faces that were, in their imperfection, more moving than any perfect likeness could have been. "This isn't frightening. This is the opposite of everything I believed about myself for 6 years. This is proof that I was seen, that I mattered, that someone thought about me every single day for 7 years, even when I had no idea, even when I thought I was invisible." She reached up and touched his face, gently, and Hugo closed his eyes. "We'll commission a 12th, she said softly. "From life this time. and will hang it here with the others. Not to replace them, but because I think they deserve to be finished. 11 attempts to remember someone who was about to come home. The wedding itself was, by every account, a beautiful affair. Small by the standards of Hugo's rank, but attended by everyone of consequence in the neighborhood, including in a development that surprised absolutely no one. Mrs. Calder, who had undergone, in the weeks since the ballroom revelations, a transformation that Winifred found she could not quite bring herself to resent. It was not that her mother had become, suddenly, a different person. The careful, withholding quality that had characterized so much of their relationship did not simply disappear. But Winifred noticed, in the days leading up to the wedding, small things. Her mother sitting with her in the evenings, asking questions about Penrose, about Hugo, about Winifred's feelings, in a manner that suggested, for the first time, genuine curiosity rather than calculation. She noticed her mother's hands trembling slightly as she helped with the final fitting of the wedding gown. She noticed, on the morning of the wedding itself, her mother standing in the doorway of Winifred's room, watching her with an expression that Winifred, after a moment, recognized. It was pride. Genuine, uncomplicated pride. The kind Winifred had spent 6 years believing her mother was incapable of feeling. For her, specifically. "You look," Mrs. Calder said, and her voice was not quite steady, "exactly like your father always said you would. He used to say you had more sense than both your sisters combined, and that one day someone would notice it, and the world would have to catch up." She paused. "I'm sorry it took me so long to notice it myself." Winifred crossed the room and embraced her mother, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything else. As for Lady Cressida Thornbury, her father, the Earl of Marchwood, upon receiving the documentation Hugo had sent him, did exactly what Hugo had predicted he would do. Lady Cressida was removed, within the week, from London society entirely, sent to live with a distant aunt in a remote part of Scotland, where, according to the few reports that reached Hampshire over the following years, she remained unmarried and largely friendless for the rest of her life. The story of what she had done, the threat, the carriage, the public unmasking, became for a time one of the most discussed scandals in years, and her name, once spoken with envy and admiration, became instead a kind of cautionary tale, invoked by mothers warning daughters against the dangers of pride and jealousy left unchecked. There is one more piece of history worth mentioning here, because it speaks directly to what Hugo did in the weeks before the wedding, quietly, without telling Winifred at all. Under the law as it stood in 1854, the property rights we discussed earlier could, in practice, be softened, though not erased, through what was called a marriage settlement. A legal agreement drawn up before the wedding that could set aside certain property or income for a wife's separate use, protected to some degree from her husband's creditors or his control. Such settlements were typically negotiated by a bride's family, as a condition of the match, to protect her interests. Winifred's family had nothing to negotiate with, and so no one had thought to ask for one. Hugo arranged one anyway, a substantial independent income settled entirely in Winifred's name, answerable to no one but herself. It was not the law that protected her, it was a choice. Married Women's Property Acts, which would one day make such protections automatic for women regardless of what their husbands chose to do, were still decades away. Now, before we close, I think it's worth reflecting on something. We've spent this evening with a woman who spent 6 years believing she was the disappointing daughter, the one who hadn't succeeded, hadn't married, hadn't lived up to whatever standard her family and her society had quietly decided mattered. And we've spent it with a man who spent 7 years being told by everyone around him that he was cold, distant, unreachable, when in fact he was simply someone who had found once a person who saw him clearly and who had never stopped searching for a way back to her. I think there's something in that for all of us. The way we're seen by others, even by the people closest to us, isn't always the truth of who we are. Sometimes it takes someone else, someone unexpected, arriving at exactly the right moment to show us what was always there. Winifred and Hugo were married on a cold, bright morning in December 1854, and the wedding breakfast that followed at Penrose was, by every account, a warm and joyful occasion. Warmer, several guests remarked, than anyone had expected from a house that had, for as long as anyone could remember, felt cold and closed. That evening, after the guests had gone, Winifred found Hugo standing once again in the locked room. Though it was not locked anymore, would never be locked again, looking at the 12 portraits that now hung on the walls. The 12th, completed just that week, hung in the center, and it was, everyone agreed, the only one that had truly captured her. Not merely her face, but something in her expression, a directness, a quiet steadiness that the other 11 had only ever gestured toward. 12 years from now, Hugo said as Winifred came to stand beside him, do you think we'll add a 13th? I think, Winifred said, slipping her hand into his, that we have a great many years ahead of us to find out. Outside, the December evening was settling into darkness, and somewhere below, the sounds of the household, servants, laughter, the ordinary business of a home beginning a new chapter, drifted up through the old stone walls of Penrose. And in the locked room that was no longer locked, surrounded by 7 years of careful, quiet devotion finally brought into the light, Winifred Calder. Winifred Penrose now understood, for the first time in her life, exactly what it felt like to be home. And that, my friends, is how a woman who spent 6 years believing she was invisible became a duchess. Not because anyone decided she deserved a title, but because someone had simply, finally, refused to look away. Thank you so much for being here with me tonight, especially after the time we've spent apart. This community means more to me than I can easily say, and coming back to it, to all of you, has reminded me why I started telling these stories in the first place. If this one moved you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're new here, welcome. I hope you'll stay a while. Until next time, my friends, take care of yourselves.